Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Ashley, your webinar organizer and the operations manager of the Evolution Institute. For those of you not familiar, the Evolution Institute is a nonprofit applying evolutionary science to pressing social issues like education. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few things so you know how to participate in today's event. Today's webinar will be recorded. I'll send everyone an email tomorrow with a link. At the end of the webinar, we'll open the floor up for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can do so in one of two ways. The first is by raising your hand, which means you can click on the small hand icon in your webinar control panel. This will allow you to speak directly to Dr. Glaze. You can also submit a question in the question box on your control panel at any time during the presentation. I'll be keeping an eye on these and we'll read them to Dr. Glaze during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If we don't get to your question today, Dr. Glaze has kindly volunteered to answer your questions in a written format, which we'll post on our website in about a week. I'll be sure to email everyone a follow-up link once they've been posted. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Amanda Glaze. Dr. Glaze teaches at Georgia Southern University and specializes in evolution, education, research, and outreach, science teacher education, and professional development. Her research focuses on the acceptance and rejection of evolution in the southeastern United States and the impact the conflict between religion and evolution has on science literacy. Her work has been featured on NPR, National Center for Science Education, and Real Scientists, among others. Dr. Glaze, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who has signed up to join us today for the webinar. What I want to talk to you about today is this concept of taboo, unspeakable, forbidden, and taboo, and look at some of the conversations that we're having about teaching and learning of evolution in the American South. But not just in the American South, around the country, as evolution education is one of the biggest issues that we are facing when it comes to science education today. And I always start my presentations by telling everyone, hello, my name is Dr. Amanda Glaze. I don't believe in evolution, and neither should you. And that's because evolution is not something that exists for us to believe in. We have physical events that occur in the natural world and physical explanations of those. And then we have beliefs that exist extra-rationally, somewhat outside of physical explanation. So we always start by framing evolution as real, as an actual series of events not up for belief. So what I do is look at evolution in Southern culture, and there are a lot of misconceptions that exist about the South. A lot of pigeonholing takes place, a lot of preconceptions that people have that because the South exists in the way that it does, with these deeply held belief systems, with this deeply held culture, a place almost where time stands still, that means that it's a function of ignorance. Very often we see people coming in the door with solutions to a problem when they haven't yet taken the time to listen to really understand what the problem is. And so when we look at evolution, the concept behind human evolution, the idea that man descended from apes, or the idea that there is a question to special creation, we have to first understand where people are coming from. We have to understand the background, and we have to define what it is that we are truly interested in before we can come in and start trying to make any kind of an impact. So when people ask me, why did I pick the South? A little bit of background. I'm born and raised in the heart of Dixie. I am from rural Alabama. My family is a Southern Baptist ministry family and has been my entire life. And as such, I have a deeply rooted love affair with the South and what it represents as a place full of biodiversity, a place where the pace is a little bit slower, a place where there is a love of people and an engagement and interaction between people that you really don't find in a lot of other places in the world. And when I started researching evolution, it was really a function of understanding why, when I, as a scientist, someone who has always been passionate about the sciences, regardless of my beliefs, was struggling to come home and have conversations with the people that I cared about and the community that I was a part of, because of this inability to mesh these two worlds that I was walking in. And so we frame this as this idea of significance of place, that there are places all over the world, small places, large places, collective groups, where the underpinning culture, that cultural currency, is so strong of a force that nothing can be understood without first considering that significance of place, that shared cultural understanding. I can tell you, growing up in the South, that church was the cornerstone of everything for society. That's where we went to dinner, that's where we played sports, that's where everything happened. And so to come into an area where you have these underpinning cultures that frame not only what is happening or where things are happening, but really provide the framework for all of society and really, in a lot of ways, identity. You have to first be willing to listen, to understand, and to ask questions before you can come in and try to pose solutions. So to frame this in context, a study by Christy Bowen a little less than 8 years ago looked at evolution, teaching, and learning across the United States and framed it in terms of a variety of political and social constructs. So looking at the difference between standards and how standards on evolution impacted the teaching of evolution, looking at whether it was a red state or a blue state, looking at things from a regional point of view. And in that study identified that students in the South are 84% less likely to receive meaningful instruction in evolution than anywhere else in the country. Similarly, students in the South are 10 times more likely to receive no instruction regarding evolution when you compare to the rest of the country when looking at high school students. Now, in conversations that I've had and that many of us have heard in blogs or in the news or in other outlets, it's often assumed that if you don't accept evolution, you obviously don't know about it. And this is one of the big misconceptions that we have to address before we can come in the door with any kind of solution. The idea that ignorance is the problem. When I first started researching evolution, I was applying a lot of my own experiences, my own positionality to understand why some people could look at evolution, weigh the evidence, take comfort and confidence in what they were reading, what they were learning, and internalize that, whereas others could not. It started out as a very easy quantitative study. I simply wanted to see what teachers thought about evolution, whether or not teachers here in the South accepted evolution. But I very quickly realized that simply looking at whether or not someone accepts or rejects is grossly oversimplifying an issue that is so much larger. And it led me into a new pathway of research, which is really connecting to my own roots, my own Southern roots as a storyteller. And that is looking at and collecting the stories that people tell about their experiences, not only learning evolution in school, but talking about evolution with parents, learning about or hearing about evolution in church, interacting with their peers when it comes to controversial topics. And some of the frameworks that have become uncovered to me through this research, I think highlight the fact that we so often, again, are unwilling to stop, to recognize that ours is not the only worldview through which we can view the world, and really understand what's going on in terms of worldview and understandings of others and what's happening. So I asked some of my participants, what do you know about evolution, or what have you heard about evolution? And these college students told me these incredibly detailed stories, everything from having classes in church that talks about evolution specifically, or having their parents tell them, if your teacher talks about evolution, you just walk out the door. You don't have to stay there and listen to that. And quite frequently when I'm telling people these stories, they say, well, they're just ignorant, they don't understand. And it's a function of something far greater. So I wanted to share a couple of pieces that came out of that. The idea that evolution is looked upon as though it were a ridiculous idea. Like you were unintelligent if you actually could possibly believe that human beings came from monkeys. To even consider the fallibility of belief is equate to turning your back on family, community, and faith. It's not a matter of ignorance that separates acceptance and rejection of evolution. It's more a matter of understanding that there are factors and forces far greater than what a person can claim to know that weigh and impact their lives. Now, as someone who grew up in a very devout evangelical Southern Baptist upbringing, I can tell you that in evangelical tradition, when a person talks about testimony, when they talk about understanding and they talk about sharing what they have with others, the idea is that not only are you responsible for your own soul, but you carry a responsibility for the souls of all other people with whom you come in contact. So when a person walks into a classroom and they tell me, this teacher won't teach evolution, she just doesn't know what she's doing, I have to ask, is that really the case? Because how does it change the framework of our understanding when we say, okay, this teacher just doesn't know it or just doesn't like it, and so she refuses to teach, as opposed to, because of the belief system that this person has come up in, because of the underlying culture and the cultural currency that frames their very identity as an evangelical Christian believer. How can I ask this person to therefore go into a classroom and possibly corrupt the minds of 30 other people when hell is a very visceral and real place? So it's a matter of understanding, of building back these blocks and understanding the stories and where people are coming from. And just to clarify, there is nothing wrong with culture. There is nothing wrong with being a believer. I firmly believe that regardless of what a person chooses to believe when it comes to religious faith, it is possible for all people to be scientifically minded. And it's absolutely a necessity for all people to be scientifically literate. But I also think that the pathways we have been taking over the last 100 years to get to that point grossly neglect the fact that worldview, identity, culture, community, all of these things play a very important role, and it's time for us to listen and learn from each other in order to reach out and better understand what's happening and have a positive impact. Most often, our focus on teaching and learning of evolution has been acceptance of evolution. And so we often have to have a conversation about the differences between acceptance of evolution, belief, and how do you bridge the gaps between what a person accepts as being fact and what they internalize beyond that understanding. And so when we look at things like acceptance of evolution, in the starter study, we realized that there were some patterns taking place that really made it a questionable construct for us to look at. And that was the fact that we had a lot of situations where we had people who had very little understanding of evolution by measure of a content examination who would still test 90 to 100% on a measure of acceptance of evolution. At the same time, we had people who could score 90 to 100% on their knowledge of evolution. But when given questions that asked about their acceptance of evolution and whether or not they internalized this as fact, we found that they actively rejected principles, even though the knowledge that they had and they held as factual were not in alignment. So essentially, we understand that knowledge and acceptance are not the nice, neat, packaged relationship that we see in a lot of science. So when I go into a classroom and I'm talking about, for example, photosynthesis, I know that if I teach my students enough about photosynthesis and I show how it's happening in these plants, take them to labs and we do experiments and they can measure gas exchange and things like that, the more familiar they become with concepts, the more likely they are to accept that photosynthesis is scientifically accurate. At the same time, when it comes to evolution, that's not the case. But yet, the way we've approached the teaching and learning of evolution for many decades now has been to simply throw more evidence, to argue more, to simply claim that obviously something else is wrong, this is right, so you must listen to our way of doing. I tell people all the time when I explain my research that my focus is on the middle ground. The idea that a majority of people fall in between on a spectrum when it comes to whether they are accepting of evolution or whether they reject evolution. Having conversations with people in context is hugely important, because when you walk into a classroom and your statement is, all of you are wrong, your beliefs are wrong, what you have grown up with is wrong or incorrect, or as I've heard some people say, outright call it lies, you have to realize that not only are you losing a large portion of your audience just by attacking those beliefs, you're also losing another portion of the audience who's watching you be intolerant, who's watching you as you don't listen. And so it closes a lot of doors that otherwise would be open. I feel like a majority of people, based on our research, really do have the potential to fall either way. But what impacts that is the interactions they have with scientists, with science-minded people, whether that be in a public venue, somewhere online, through webinars, through Twitter. It really resonates with people when they hear, this is not about me being right and you being wrong. It's about everyone being scientifically literate, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what their beliefs happen to be, and creating a space where those conversations can take place and those explorations can take place. The idea of challenging everything that represents your identity is one that cannot be taken in any way lightly. And yet we often charge in the door guns blazing, for lack of a better analogy, when it comes to these scientific concepts, without even considering the fact that you're starting a very tumultuous, even for those that are willing to start making that shift to scientific thinking, you're starting a very tumultuous pathway that often results in social outcasts. It results in losing connections to people, places, and things that are held very deeply. And so it's interesting to me that we often look at science as being separated from concepts in humanities, but yet we see with evolution, with stem cells, with cloning, even with climate change in a lot of ways, these psychological overlaps with the concept of identity and how these ways of knowing that we focus on, these ways of knowing that we harbor, and these ideas that we entertain and how they interact with one another are strongly impacted by our identity and are really a part of who we are. And so I say all of that to say this. Again, for me, it's not about being right. It's not about going out to tell everyone how wonderful evolution is, even though I think it is. It's the idea that regardless of what anyone else thinks or feels or believes, we are absolutely at war for scientific literacy. If you don't believe that, take a look at any newspaper, at any news outlet today, and look at what's going on with fake news. Look at these arguments that are taking place surrounding things like climate change. Looking at, the divisions that are forming day by day to a greater extent between this idea of us versus them, whatever the us and whatever the them happens to be. I think for a long time we have put dividers up where It's either you're religious or you're scientific, whereas you can be perfectly religious and scientifically minded. You can be atheistic and scientifically minded. Good science is going to be good science regardless of the beliefs of the person who is practicing the science. It's important for us to understand that we have to distinguish between these ways of knowing, that we have to stop making it a us versus them, a one or the other, and really focus on the fact that science is about explaining physical events in a physical world, that science and theology are not one and the same. There are two very distinct ways of knowing, and they are ways of knowing that can overlap with one another inside of a person and as part of their identity if they so choose. At the end of the day, I don't care what someone opts to believe if they choose to have faith or subscribe to a specific religion or belief set. What matters to me is that at the end of the day, they're able to set that hat aside as needed to make decisions based on evidence, to understand that science is not the enemy, that, you know, the purpose of science is not to disprove the existence of God, which some people actively say, that science can't even consider the existence of God as a possible explanation, that it's two separate ways of knowing, and that it's wholly possible to be scientifically minded, to be a lover of science, to be religious or not religious, based on having that understanding, that scientific literacy for all. So in order to reach that end, we really have to look back at what works and what doesn't. Obviously, throwing evidence and facts and arguments out there is not enough to cause conceptual change. In order to impact deeper thinking, deeper cultural underpinnings when it relates to things like science and scientific thinking, you have to understand the underpinnings. You have to know where people are coming from. You have to value the fact that people bring different things to the table, and you have to allow for that safe space for people to be willing to ask questions. I can tell you, as someone who grew up in as a literalist creationist, that one of the hardest things I ever had to do when I fell in love with science the way that I did was ask questions that were considered hard questions. If you go back to the quote at the beginning of my presentation, it talks about how to question anything in the Bible would equate to throwing everything out. And yet we expect teachers to come into a classroom and approach this as if it were nothing. We expect students to walk in and just throw their beliefs aside and just take everything we're saying for face value because it's science and we said so. And while we do have scientific evidence, while everything is supported, we have to first pave the way for those conversations to happen. Because if I'm terrified to ask questions, I'm not going to have anyone to go to when my identity starts to shift. I'm not going to have anyone there for me to the level that that cultural currency has been there for my entire life. And that's something that we really have to take into consideration. So I talk a lot about Southern Revolution because I really want to have an impact on how we talk about evolution, not only in the South, around the country, but especially in places where there is such a deep stigma that surrounds the concept of simply things changing, of that descent with modification, of the idea that we share common ancestry, and that, you know, regardless of what you understand with science, that comes through in terms of our thinking and our ability to reason and our ability to get beyond things that make us uncomfortable and listen to both sides and learn from both sides. And so looking at some of these underpinnings, we look at things like public perceptions of evolution, looking at things like our first-tier comparative. If you go back to Gallup, who's run a poll for 30-some-odd years, we can see that the patterns and trends with public acceptance of evolution have only slightly shifted over a 30-year time period. In the United States, we still have many more people who are accepting of a theistic view of evolution or a creationist view with no evolution than we have those who are accepting of a secular view of evolution, which is only about 19%. but we're looking at somewhere around 30% of the population subscribing to a literalist, creationist background. And yet we're trying to come in and challenge that with nothing but information. We also see that the United States has a very interesting position nationally or internationally. Only Turkey has a lower level of acceptance of evolution among the general public among all first-tier nations in the world. And as we can see through recent news, Turkey has recently decided to remove their evolution standards. So it's going to be interesting to see over the next few years how these things move and shift in parallel. One thing I do want to focus on, though, is the idea that because someone is anti-evolution, that they are automatically anti-science. And I'll say this, in my experience with talking with parents, students, clergy, community members, random people on the street, around the South, because storytelling and listening to stories is what I do, it's not a matter of being anti-science. It's a matter of feeling like you're being attacked for your beliefs, and the fact that there are a lot of very vocal people, a lot of loud voices that are really on both sides of the aisle saying you can either be one or the other. Again, that us versus them. And so we have to dismiss the idea that we're dealing with people who are ignorant. We have to dismiss the idea that we're dealing with people who are anti-science, because a lot of these people love science. They love what science has to offer. They love technology. But they're genuinely, legitimately terrified of the idea of losing their soul. They're terrified of the consequences, the perceived consequences, which are very, very real. And so how do we translate that when it comes to evolution education? We really have to look beyond how we're having these conversations and start opening up dialogue. I always feel the need to say here that I do not in any way advocate for the teaching of intelligent design or any other mixing of beliefs and science. But I do feel like people individually have the ability to maintain both. I mean, we see people like Francis Collins, who are very notable Christians, but then also very good scientists. So it's a matter of kind of setting aside that judgment and being willing to focus on something bigger than the idea of, I want everyone to accept evolution. It's like, I want everyone to be scientifically literate. I want everyone to be able to think and problem solve. So when we look across populations, not only in the South but around the country, we see patterns in these things. We see that knowledge is not the be-all, end-all, that being able to ask questions and being able to probe and being able to kind of test the bounds of identity are more important than the knowledge and the information that we're actually putting out there. Being able to recognize the beliefs and cultures that are coming into a classroom or coming into a conversation, and instead of bottling those up and trying to kind of one-size-fits-all, force everything in one direction, being able to open that door and open those conversations and allow for safe space for exploring and understanding. Being able to explain and understand what your own worldview is. A lot of people subscribe to certain beliefs or subscribe to certain ideas because that's what they've been told to do. And so when they have the opportunity to go beyond what they've been told and really understand, you know, this is what I believe, this is why I believe that, this is where that comes from, it enables them to open up. It enables them to identify where they fall on a spectrum. And only when you understand that do you really know where to start with someone to lead them into a conversation about, okay, this is how science fits in your life, even though you have these other beliefs. I get into a lot of arguments with people about semantics. I will tell you, I tell people I don't believe in evolution, and people get up in arms about that, but there's a difference between belief and understanding. The idea that you can be rational or irrational or extra-rational is another area of semantics, that we tend to make everything, again, us versus them, black or white, where you're either rationally thinking and it's a scientific worldview, or you're irrational and you're unscientific, without realizing that there are a lot of things that fall on a spectrum that are extra rational, meaning that they're legitimized, they are beneficial, they have that focus, they have that function culturally or in society. Even though they may not fall under rational, they may fall somewhere outside of rational consideration. But we have to differentiate between these things in order to better understand where people fall and what's happening. A lot of it is tied to misunderstanding, misconceptions, especially when it comes to the nature and practice of science, and the idea that science is tentative, and the idea that, you know, science can never prove anything. Here we have something that makes science one of the most powerful ways of thinking, the idea that we're never sated, we're never satisfied with the answer. And yet it's the very thing that's most frequently used against us when we talk about things like evolution and climate change, the idea that it's just a theory, or the misconception that somehow a theory, once proven, is elevated into a law. You know, these are all things that are, you know, very prevalent, not only in classrooms, but in the public. But yet we very frequently fail to focus on these small elements, instead choosing to, you know, I hate to say, beat to death the idea that, oh, you just don't understand it, you're ignorant, you just don't get it, let me talk at you about all of this knowledge that you don't understand. Failing to realize that when we do that, when we take that approach, we're really shutting down all the lines of communication and having the exact opposite effect on the issue that we really want to have. So going back to that Gallup poll, as of 2014, this is where we fell, that about 45% of the population was connected with or subscribed to a creationist belief set. Now, in the last few years, that's gone down just a bit, but it still hovers between the 35 and 45% range, and we still only see about 20% of people accepting a secular view of evolution. So what we're looking at here, though, is between a 50 to 60% range of people in the population that are open to the idea of evolution, whether it's secular or theistic. And so to me, that's a lot more hopeful than what we often focus on, which is where we have shortcomings or where we have perceptions of need and conflict. So one of the things that I wanted to do based on the studies that I've already conducted around the South is to finally kind of put to rest the idea that there is a regional difference. We know that there are certain results from studies, most of which have been done in the Midwest or in the Northeast, that suggest findings that were very different from what we were able to find in several studies in the South. A lot of that speculation due to, you know, differences in culture, differences in significance of place, differences in presence and absence of religious beliefs. And so we set out to undertake a major national study, so this national undergraduate study on evolution, looking at undergraduate students around the country. And so this has been in data collection for 2 years and has more than 20,000 data points, looking at everything from religiosity levels to what religious beliefs people subscribe to, levels of acceptance of evolution, understandings of the nature of science, a wide variety of measures employed here to look at where we are nationally with our undergraduate students and get an idea of what are some of the trends and patterns from region to region that we really haven't been able to explore or address in the past because we had sporadic samples or we had mismatched measurements. And so right now the demographics fit very closely with nationally reported demographics for a university population. A little higher female to male ratio, pretty close racial breakdown, and a pretty close level breakdown, seeing as how most freshmen are required to take a biology class. A lot of people don't take a science their sophomore year and then they come back and take junior and senior year. So we have a pretty good breakdown in our original snapshot as to representation that is parallel to what we see in the overall national undergraduate population. What's interesting is when we start looking at snapshot numbers, and what I'm going to share actually in just a moment is from our first cycle. So this is an early poll. It's only about 25% of our data. But we see that nationally we have an evolution acceptance level among undergraduate students at a rate of about 73%. Now, just to clarify, this doesn't mean that they accept 73% of evolution. It means that on a rating scale, 73% of that their score is 73%, excuse me, on a scale of 20 to 100 points, being as how there are no zero scores. So when we look at that, what we see is a moderate acceptance of evolution. Most frequently, the issues that people have, as we've documented before, are issues that have to do with the concept of special creation. People are very willing to be open to elements of evolution in animals and all other things, but then when you start talking about human evolution, it gets a little touchy. So these are all things that we're looking at on a question-by-question basis to try to determine where those patterns are and what that means. Now, if you look, though, in comparison from the southern region, which spans from Louisiana over to South Carolina and then includes Florida up to Tennessee, we see an evolution acceptance comparably lower at 58% compared to 72.6% at the national level. Now, notice, though, in content area, we actually have a higher understanding of content overall among that regional group than what we have in the national group. So this aligns with the information, with the data that we've collected in the past in the South that shows that it's something much more than just understanding that is impacting whether or not a person is accepting of evolution. Previous studies suggest that a full 14% of variance, a pretty good bit, out of 50% explained in a quantitative study, is tied specifically to whether or not a person identifies themselves as being religious. So it gives us another avenue to really start to pursue, to look at what is it about these specific religious groups, these specific pockets that we see that make some more open than others. Same thing with nature of science. We have a much higher understanding in the southern region when it comes to how science is conducted, the ideas of laws and theories, these basic premises, than what we have nationally. And yet, we see such a massive gap in acceptance of evolution. So the data is highly suggestive that there is something much more going on than simply understanding or misunderstanding when it comes to this issue. If we compare this to some of our studies with pre-service teachers, we'll see that it's pretty solid across the board in terms of our pre-service teachers tend to have very similar ideas to our science majors. So the idea that acceptance would be higher among teachers than it would among other students is not validated. Similarly, the idea that acceptance among biology students is significantly higher than it is among other students was also not confirmed. We see persistent problems across levels, regardless of whether one is an undergraduate student, regardless of whether one is a high school student, regardless of whether one is a future science teacher, with these misconceptions, misunderstandings, and struggles when it comes to acceptance of evolution. Now, when we consider the percentage of the population that will actually go on to college from high school, as many people, high school is their last or only formal experience with evolution or with teaching and learning of science, we're looking at a large group of the population. If we're not reaching these undergraduate students, if we're not reaching pre-service science teachers, these people who are on the front lines of interactions with the public, where we're really digging ourselves into a hole that we're not going to be able to have that strong impact on teaching and learning of evolution or on scientific literacy. So again, one of the things I focus on is the idea that I conduct my research in the South, but it's not because the South is a place that is backwards or absent of understanding or absent of knowledge or absent of conceptualization when it comes to science or even specifically evolution. It's the fact that there is such an identity built around this significance of place, that there is such a power to the underpinning cultural currency of a region, that it really highlights the need for us to be more understanding, for us to be more open and willing to listen and learn about others before we start trying to propose solutions or provide blanket one-size-fits-all advice. The South is a really dynamic place, and it's an amazing place to study evolution. And I get to collect stories from people whose parents have gone to school or been punished for talking about science at home. I get to talk about people who, you know, in their attempts to talk about evolution positively as a youth minister in a church was, you know, essentially told, you either stop doing that or we're going to let you go. It's not the idea that even with those ways of thinking that it's backwards. It's the idea that we simply come in from an outside point of view and try to put an outsider's pinpoint perspective on things, and then we wonder why all of our attempts to make a difference blow up in our faces. Whereas we really need to be looking at these very dynamic, very living, very intersectional pieces and places, and really getting a better grasp of not only where the people that we're trying to work with are coming from, but where we're coming from, and how we can gather all of that cultural currency together and use it as a tool to improve our understanding not only of evolution, not only of science, but of each other. You know, evolution is a huge challenge to us in education today. We see this on a grand scale with fights for standards. We see this on a grand scale in the news in the South when we have these academic freedom laws going into place and other House bills that are constantly challenging the teaching of science and what's representative of science and how to keep science separate from beliefs in a science classroom. We see that a lot of students are getting no exposure to evolution. They're not learning about it. The only thing they ever hear, like my experience in high school, was a high school teacher who stood up and said, our next chapter is on evolution, but we're not going to cover it. Write down change over time and move on. Because they're afraid. They're afraid. There's not a place to have these conversations where it's safe. The concept of taboo, while we think of it as 17th century, is very much alive and well in many places, not only around the world, but in the United States. And learning how to navigate these things, learning how to navigate these sacred spaces for people and how to have these hard conversations, I think, is going to be imperative, not only for us for scientific literacy, but for the very fabric of our society as we continue to move forward, looking back at some of the things that have been taking place over the last year. We have to identify misconceptions. We have to understand. We have to take the time to do things the right way. And that takes work, and it takes understanding, and it takes a willingness to set aside your own biases and your own issues with something and just really listen. Listen and take interest and be willing to learn. If we're not willing to do that, we're never going to have an impact like we need to when it comes to worldview. And even to that extent, the idea that we are the ones that get a say in whose worldview is right. We want everyone to have a scientific worldview, but we also want everyone to have their own worldview. We want identity and individual. It's an inherent part of who we are. And so I love to share what I do. I love to talk about what I do because I feel like it is a place where I can really encourage people to listen and do more. Even though the focus is on science, to me it's so much larger. It's on really growing as a society to the point where we're able to harness and understand science and technology and human nature and identity and the individual in a way that is light years beyond where we are now. One thing in closing, we always look at, it seems like, the negatives that exist in spaces and the ways that we're not meeting the grade or the ways that we're not doing good things. And so one thing I do want to highlight is the great thing about Evolution Ed in the American South is that it really does try to put the focus on the things that we're doing right, whereas we do have a need to improve how we're teaching evolution. We do have a need to look at how we're talking about culture and identity. But at the same time, there is some pretty amazing research being done in Alabama and around the American South when it comes to evolution, when it comes to biodiversity, when it comes to people like myself, like Chris Lynn, like Bill Evans, Laura Reed, our other collaborators, Prasanta Chakrabarty at LSU, Ian Benz at UNCC. There is a cohort of people that are actively on the front lines trying to understand, trying to build these relationships and bridge these gaps. So if it's something that you're interested in, please, we all encourage you to reach out to us, to join in, to get engaged. The Smithsonian's Human Origin Program is a fantastic place to do this, and there's some amazing research going on with them in the South as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. This was an absolutely great presentation. We've gotten a few questions. Some questions were in reference actually to some of the research that you cited. So I let some of those individuals know that we would work together and we would get a list of those citations so they can look at them further. So we have a really great question from Stephanie from NCSE. And she said, are you advocating that teachers have conversations about religion in a classroom? Couldn't that get teachers in trouble? How do you get the culture into the open without stepping outside the boundaries of what is acceptable?
There's a fabulous free resource for teachers called the Culturally Responsive Strategies and Cultural and Religious okay, I'm losing my words. It's the CRS approach, and it's actually available for free on the Human Origins website. And it proposes and it provides resources for having conversations about religion as a way of knowing. So there's a difference between coming into a classroom and saying, okay, you know, here's what your religious beliefs are. Let's talk about your beliefs. Because whenever we have that kind of conversation, we're kind of setting the stage for a conflict. But we can talk about how religion is a way of knowing separate from a scientific way of knowing. We can look at different points of view from different world religions and be representative of all of these different ways of coping or compartmentalizing and looking at it from kind of an objective step back where it's not our beliefs that we're looking at, it's the idea of how people believe and how people know. And it actually provides a fantastic framework because one of the things that comes about from having a conversation about religion is the idea that my science does not exist to attack your religion, which is a misconception that a lot of people have had and have that's developed very strongly over the course of a lifetime. So, you know, when I was teaching in a middle school and high school classroom, the very first thing I ever did was always teach about the nature of science and talk about how religion cannot be used as an explanation in science and make that very clear to my students that religion is this way of knowing, that science is this way of knowing, and that the two do not have to be at odds, that they're simply separate ways of viewing things in the world. I think a lot of times we worry and we have this great deal of fear about having those conversations simply because as teachers or as parents, we're afraid that that conflict is going to exist. I'm sorry, I can't pull the citation out of my head right now. I want to say it's Herman, maybe 2013, was looking at the perceptions that teachers have of the conflict of evolution in their classroom, and quite frankly, usually the perception of the conflict was so much more than what the actual conflict was. So whereas teachers were terrified to have these conversations because they perceived that their students were going to be uncomfortable, they perceived that parents were going to push back, when asked over the course of their career, you know, how many actually had, quite frequently the answer was none. But we build it up in our mind. It's such a taboo because maybe we've struggled with it personally. Maybe an administrator has said something about it in passing, or we have some kind of this preconception that it's this big bad elephant, you know, in the corner of the room, whereas quite often the perceptions are much more pronounced than what the reality is.
Thanks, Amanda. Let's see. We've got another question here from Jack. He asked, do you see the fear of the loss of a literal view of one's religion as a major driver of evolution denial? So is it true that if one applies scientific knowledge and reasoning to literal religious views, let's say like the story of Noah, then they will indeed lose those traditional views? So does this verify that fear? One may still be religious, but their more literal view will change once they apply scientific reasoning to the traditional stories of the Bible.
And there are different ways that people cope. Like I said, there are people who compartmentalize. There are people who engage in what we call cognitive apartheid, where they actively elect, even though these things are in direct contradiction to each other or, you know, seemingly conflict with one another, they actively elect to continue to hold on to their literalist worldview as well as have that scientific worldview. And I know a lot of people would argue that if you have to hold on to both, that you're not fully embracing either. But I think people decide what they can and can't live with. Fear, when it comes to literalist belief systems, fear is very much a driver in whether people will actually even have a conversation. And so when you factor in the fact that you've already got fear of possibly challenging your beliefs or possibly losing some of your faith, and then you have that added fear of who do I talk to about this, because I'm going to be judged if I go home and talk to people about it. I might be outcast if I talk to these people about it. I don't feel comfortable talking to my professor about it. So it's a very tangible, earth-shattering fear, and a lot of people that I've talked to that have shifted, much like I have, from literalist creationist upbringings to more scientific worldviews, whether they became atheists or didn't become atheists or, you know, shifted their denomination or whatever they happen to do, there's always been a very long, very painful process involved in that. And I think that's what we really have to remember, is we're not talking about a simple decision. We're talking about a life-altering shift in identity when we have these conversations. And so, you know, pardon me for saying, by God, we better take care in how we have them. We better take care in how we approach this, and we better provide resources and safe spaces and support for people if we're going to lead them down that path, because for a lot of people it really means losing a part of who they are.
And we have a great question actually that follows up exactly with what you were speaking about from Matt. And he says that looking at U.S. cultures in a broad perspective, can you share your opinion on how divergent the gap is between believers and non-believers? So is it an either-or division, or is it more of a gradual scale? So he's curious on how your teaching approaches might change if the non-science belief is only lightly ingrained.
Well, it certainly is a kind of a sliding scale, because even among believers, there are groups that are widely accepting and supportive of evolution, and then there are some that are not. So, you know, it really does matter. Now, as far as what I've always done in practice, I always approach it from the same, whether it's a group that is evangelical, literalist, or moderately religious. To me, it's a matter of focusing on that nature of science and ways of knowing, And that's a powerful tool regardless of whether or not beliefs are in play. I mean, even if someone has no beliefs, even if someone is atheistic or agnostic or whatever they happen to be, there's always a need to understand that science works the way science works, that it is uncertain, that it is about self-correction, that that these premises exist. And so it's not even that we're catering how we teach specifically to this religious group or the other. It's a matter of simply laying down the proper foundations for understanding of the nature and the history and the philosophy of science before you start throwing the concepts and the understandings and the jargon on top of it.
That's great. Thanks very much, Amanda. I think we have time for just one more question, and this is from Dan. He says that interesting arguments for separating knowledge belief gaps, especially in education, but I'm wondering how your conversations or instructions on evolution can confront issues when beliefs, even if the knowledge is there, impact the way the knowledge can function. So, for example, climate change denying impacting specific policy.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the backside of this research, which is, yes, the focus is on helping people understand evolution. Yes, the focus is on scientific literacy. But let's be honest, at the heart of this is the matter of learning how to listen to other people and understand where they're coming from in order to bridge gaps in conversation. That's not a side effect of what I do. It's one of the main driving features. And that's the idea that culture and understanding and bridging gaps and finding middle ground has got to happen. We are to that point. And I think colleagues like Catherine Hayhoe, who studies climate change, we have these kind of conversations because we both feel the same way. There is just not enough listening. There's too much of us versus them, and that impacts policy because of that perpetuation. It's a self-perpetuating prophecy that there's distrust, that there is misunderstanding, that there is the idea of, they're out to get us. And so a lot of what we do is trying to find ways to mend that, because once we can mend that and really, I don't want to say take control of the middle ground, but find that middle ground, I think we'll find that a lot of that perceived anti-science sentiment, a lot of that even perceived anti-evolution sentiment will start to die down. And the same, I think, is true for climate change. You can't have a conversation if you can't get people to the table.
That's great. Thanks again, Amanda, and thankfully we've been able to answer all of the questions that were submitted. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact me. It's going to be abailey@evolution-institute.org. Once you leave today's webinar, you'll receive a very short survey on the presentation, and we'd really appreciate it if you'd provide your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email tomorrow, and that will have a link with today's recording, with the recording of the webinar, and also a copy of Amanda's slides, and we'll work on getting those citations for you as well. So on behalf of the Evolution Institute and Dr. Glaze, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.